This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
You know, if you ask a historian what the most intellectually explosive period in human history was, you'd probably get answers like classical Athens or maybe the Enlightenment.
The usual suspects.
Exactly. But today we are diving deep into a far more surprising and I think ultimately tragic candidate, the Islamic Golden Age.
It's a period we, celebrate for all these incredible advancements, algebra, optics, medicine. But the real story we're tracking in the sources today is the fate of reason itself.
Okay.
I mean, imagine an empire so vast, so complex, that it had to aggressively import external knowledge, Greek philosophy, Persian bureaucracy, Indian science, just to survive its own success.
So it was a necessity.
It was. And our mission today is to look at the blueprint for this massive intellectual adoption and then, crucially, explain why that foundation of reason was eventually, cast out.
That's the core of it. We've got a stack of sources here detailing the Abbasid Caliphate's struggle, really, to govern a world-spanning civilization. And it's so clear this isn't just cultural curiosity.
No, not at all.
It's about a political structure that needed external intellectual resources just to keep the whole thing running.
Exactly. We are looking at the full life cycle here.
Yeah.
From, that first moment of utility through this really deep integration, and then finally to a decisive institutional rejection. It's a powerful, almost cautionary tale.
Okay, so let's unpack this. When did this critical absorption of foreign culture, the movement that led to Baghdad's famous House of Wisdom, when did it truly begin?
Well, while you see some initial translation work happening under the earlier Umayyad dynasty, the serious state-sponsored movement really takes off in the early Abbasid period.
Right.
It peaks pretty significantly around the 9th century. And this was a centralized effort. I mean, they were sometimes paying translators the weight of their finished work in gold.
Wow. And what's fascinating, and something that immediately jumps out from the research, is where they started. They didn't begin with pure philosophy, right? Not Plato's ethics or metaphysics.
Absolutely not. The initial strategy was pure triage. They were prioritizing practical knowledge that addressed immediate needs.
Which makes sense.
Think of it this way. If you're a massive empire trying to centralize power, what do you need first?
You need systems. Tax collection, troop health, building management, that sort of thing.
Precisely. So first came medicine texts from Galen, whose influence was just enormous astronomy, and the really crucial practical sciences like mathematics, a lot of which came from India.
And more than that, even.
Oh, yeah. They also needed highly specific knowledge, geography, land surveying, and statistical knowledge to manage these incredibly complex irrigation systems and tax regimes across Mesopotamia, Persia, and beyond.
You know, the sources point out this powerful global analogy here, this idea of prioritizing hard science and administrative tools before the deep philosophy. It's the exact same pattern we see much, much later when Japan adopted Western culture. It's like there's a universal order to intellectual necessity.
And what makes the Abbasid case so unique is the sheer size of the problem they were trying to solve. The underlying reason for this massive, almost frantic cultural influx was something we can call severe institutional fatigue.
Institutional fatigue. What do you mean by that?
The empire had just grown too large, too complex, and way too diverse for the existing legal framework, the Quran and the early Islamic legal tradition, to govern effectively on its own.
So you're saying the foundational documents, as important as they were just insufficient to run a global bureaucracy?
Yes. The sheer administrative load managing vast populations, trade routes, court disputes that are hundreds of miles apart, it just outpaced the speed at which their internal structures could evolve. The empire was really struggling to maintain coherence.
So accepting foreign culture wasn't a luxury. It was a necessary, proactive measure, a kind of civilizational reinforcement construction project.
That's a perfect way to put it. They were mobilizing everything they could find to stabilize the state. And it wasn't just Greek science. It involved adopting Persian bureaucracy, especially Sasanian methods, Greek medicine, Indian mathematics, and leveraging the huge knowledge networks of the Syrian Christian communities.
So they were pragmatic.
Incredibly pragmatic during this era, because their political survival really depended on it.
Okay, here's where it gets really compelling for me. Once the practical tools are in, why did the heavy intellectual artillery, the complete philosophical system of Aristotle, become not just tolerated, but essential for the state?
Well, this brings us to Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, in the 10th and 11th centuries. And you just cannot see him as some quiet scholar in a library.
Right.
He was a political heavyweight. a genuine intellectual mercenary.
An intellectual mercenary. What does that mean in this context?
It means he was this constant, highly sought-after headhunting target. His expertise was so vital that these competing dynasties across the Persian sphere, where the Abbasid power was already weakening, would hire him as a vizier, a high-ranking official.
So he was paid to think for the state.
Immensely. Not just for his medical knowledge, but because he held the keys to sophisticated state theory.
But I'm still trying to connect the dots. Why was philosophy indispensable for, say, tax collection or military strategy? I get logic, medicine, sure, but metaphysics, that feels like an academic luxury.
And that's the key distinction. This is where our sources provide that real aha moment. Aristotle's system was adopted as a complete package because it provided something the existing tradition lacked. A secular, universally understandable framework for justifying imperial law.
A framework that went beyond just theological interpretation.
Exactly. A framework for political decisions that extended far beyond the local village level.
Okay, break that down for me.
Think of governance as needing two things: the how and the why. Logic provided the how, the structure, for making consistent, rational arguments in a court of law or a tax audit.
Okay, makes sense.
But metaphysics provided the deeper why. It dealt with the nature of existence, immutable truth, eternal principles.
So by integrating Aristotle's metaphysics, they could argue that new, complex imperial laws like for international trade or property disputes weren't just arbitrary rulings from a caliph.
Precisely. They were derived from universal, rational, unchanging truths. It was a way to ground the authority of the state in something that felt absolute but was expressed through reason.
Wow. So Ibn Sina wasn't just studying philosophy. He was the central figure in this project to, as you said, supplement the institutional fatigue of the Islamic Empire with reason. He was a reason engineer.
He literally was. He was integrating Aristotelian thought to make the existing legal and political structure strong enough to hold up an empire of that scale.
That's such a precarious role, though. A philosopher trying to hold a fracturing empire together with sheer intellectual force.
It was incredibly precarious. He often had to flee rulers when political fortunes changed, which tells you everything about the political risk involved in championing pure rationality.
And if we fast forward a bit, we see this whole rationalist movement start to shift geographically, right? As the Abbasid center began to crumble.
Correct. So you have Ibn Sina, based mainly in the Eastern Persian sphere, and he successfully Islamizes Aristotle.
What does that mean to Islamize him?
It means he worked to reconcile Aristotle's more radical concepts, like the idea that the world is eternal and uncreated, with the fundamental Islamic doctrine of creation, ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. He made reason fit inside the theological framework.
But the project eventually moved west, didn't it?
Yes, over to Al-Andalus Islamic Spain, where we find Averroes in the 12th century. He was really the final major figure in this line, and he tried to restore what's called pure Aristotelianism.
What's the difference between Averroes' pure Aristotle and Ibn Sina's Islamized version?
Well, Averroes looked at Ibn Sina's attempts to harmonize everything and basically said no. He argued that if we're going to use Aristotle, we have to use his arguments as written, even if they directly conflict with core theological principles like creation.
So he was a purist.
He was trying to uphold the strict rational integrity of the philosopher. He became the final protector of the flame of reason, just as philosophy's institutional decline really began.
It sounds like a system that was working, even if it was precarious. But our sources point to this seismic intellectual shift that just derailed the whole project. And this is where Al-Ghazali enters the scene.
Al-Ghazali, from 1058 to 1111, is the genius of Islamic theology, who basically slammed the brakes on this entire rationalist trend.
Right.
Now, he wasn't anti-science. He accepted the utility of logic and mathematics. But he was profoundly concerned about philosophy's social influence and its tendency to erode religious belief among the educated elite.
He saw it as a kind of spiritual infection.
Exactly. His critique was surgical. He didn't waste time on Aristotle's physics or medicine. He went straight for the jugular. Metaphysics, specifically focusing on three key issues.
Okay, what were they?
First, eternalism. The idea the world had no beginning, which obviously contradicts creation. Second, rigid causality, the belief that events follow fixed scientific laws. Ghazali argued this challenged God's absolute power to intervene at any moment.
I've heard his famous example for that.
Right, that when fire burns cotton, It's not the fire's intrinsic nature doing it. It's God actively recreating the link between the fire and the burning at every single instant.
It's a fundamental theological defense against the cold certainty of Greek philosophy. And he didn't just publish a thesis, did he?
No. His landmark work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, was a cultural bomb. It effectively declared philosophical metaphysics to be a dangerous heresy. And this event symbolized this huge top-down move toward the tightening of religion and the reconstruction of orthodoxy.
But wait, if we connect this back to what you said earlier, that the Abbasids began fracturing politically way back in the 9th century, the same time they were importing Aristotle, then was Ghazali's theological critique the cause of the decline, or was it just a very successful symptom of an empire that was already falling apart politically?
That's a crucial question. And the sources confirm that Ghazali's attack happened when the political weakening was already well underway. The collapse of reason wasn't just an intellectual choice. It was a political preference for religious unity over intellectual complexity.
So if Aristotelian reason, as deployed by Ibn Sina, was so vital for running the empire, why was philosophy ultimately excluded? Why didn't utility save it?
The sources point to two core internal factors. First, the political landscape shifted dramatically. As society weakened and fragmented into smaller, competing states, the priority just became religious unity, cohesion.
It's a defense mechanism.
It's a tribal or religious defense mechanism, and it's easier to mobilize than complex, sophisticated, rational systems. They chose, you could say, spiritual and social defense over technical, bureaucratic management.
And the second factor?
The political power of that rational camp, the viziers, the high officials, the intellectual mercenaries who backed Ibn Sina's style of governance, it just declined significantly after al-Ghazali's critique successfully shifted the political mood. They lost their institutional backing.
And then, on top of this internal weakness, you have absolute external chaos, turning a contraction into a total collapse.
That is the final stage. This internal structural weakness coincided with devastating external disasters that just eliminated the physical and institutional capacity to maintain these traditions.
We're talking about the Crusades.
The Crusades destabilizing the Western frontiers, the final political collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate, the rise of military groups like the Mamluks, and, most catastrophically, the Mongol invasions.
The scale of the Mongol destruction, I think, often gets glossed over.
It was staggering. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, they didn't just destroy the political center. They systematically destroyed the physical infrastructure of knowledge, the libraries, the universities.
Even if a revival were possible.
The texts and the institutions were simply gone. That combination, theological repudiation, political disintegration, and civilizational catastrophe, it sealed reason's fate.
So to summarize this huge arc for you listening, practical knowledge came first for pure utility. Then Aristotle was imported as this central political engineering tool by figures like Ibn Sina. Then al-Ghazali launched a devastating theological attack. And finally, political fragmentation and external collapse sealed the deal.
And it's really worth noting the profound structural parallel the sources draw. The acceptance of Aristotle into the Abbasid world was structurally very similar to what Thomas Aquinas did later, integrating Aristotle into European thought in the 13th century.
Both were massive reinforcement construction projects.
Exactly. Both designed to strengthen a civilization with this powerful rational toolkit.
But the key difference, as noted in the sources, is that the Islamic integration failed institutionally, while the European one succeeded and, well, fundamentally paved the way for the Renaissance.
And this raises a really important question for you to consider as you finish this deep dive. Given the same raw intellectual material, Aristotle, what was the fundamental political or social element that existed in Europe but was lacking or actively rejected in the Abbasid Empire that prevented that great reinforcement construction project from achieving permanent, successful integration? Something profound to mull over until our next deep dive.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.